So who's got the right to water? So let's get started. So first, let me take you on a little imaginary ride. Imagine that you're living in this kind of environment. So you can see it's not really conducive to your life, there's not really a lot of water, you're actually having an issue with drought here. So imagine that you're living here, and imagine then what the state obligations are. Is the state still obligated to give you access to water? Does it need to make a new infrastructure here to get you access? Should the state maybe encourage you to move? All of these questions are things that relate to human rights and also to state obligations. But if you look closer at this image, you might recognize this, because it has been in the news for the past few years. Does anyone know where this is?
Please, can you speak up?
Oh, am I not clear? Is this better for you? Yeah? Or no? Can the mic be turned up? Is it good like that? Anyone else having issues hearing me? No? Okay. Okay, so my question was, if you look at this image, you may recognize it from the news in the past couple of years. Does anyone know where this is? Yes? South Africa, and why? Why, yes? Well, you are indeed correct. This is South Africa. This is the Theewaterskloof Dam. And this is a dam that has actually been running out of water for the past couple of years. And as a result of that, South Africa, or specifically Cape Town, was going towards 0 day. That is a day in which they would be out of water completely, resulting in complete drought and having to actually ration water. So this is not only an issue of places like South Africa, places like Cape Town, but something that is a global issue or becoming a global issue. So by the time we're in 2040, we are talking about extreme drought and extreme water stress. So in places like Brazil, but also in certain places here in Europe, we will have issues around water access. So when we talk about complete drought and extreme water issues, we are not talking about something that is only local, we are talking about a global issue. Now today I'm going to take you to, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, which relate directly to these issues. Of course, water is relevant for all of these goals. Without water, you cannot alleviate people out of poverty. You cannot get people to be able to deal with climate change. There are also issues around energy, because water can, of course, be a reliable, safe, clean energy source. But I would like to focus on the two main topics which relate to water, which are clean water and sanitation, and life below water. So this kind of relates to who's got the right to water. We not only look at us as humans, but we also need to look at what are the ecological needs and how can we balance those also to make sure that future generations are secured or have a secured access to water. So, when we talk about water rights, because I am a lawyer, we can kind of distinguish different ways of getting access to water. We often look at how we can connect water rights to land ownership. So if you, for instance, own a piece of land, through this land you will have access to the water that is connected to this land, but also groundwater. So that is a way of requiring water rights. You also have water rights which relate to a first come, first serve basis. So if you get access to or find a well somewhere that is not previously owned by anyone, you might be able to occupy this well and get access through that well to water. So these are two ways of getting water rights. You can also think of other ways, for instance, through permits, where you can get access to water through a permit by applying to the government, and in that way you can get water rights. And what is interesting in these water rights is that it also relates to, for instance, agriculture. If you see this image, it was also, I think, the image that Laura used for this event. You can see that, or you can actually see that on the right, someone might have access to water on, for instance, land ownership basis, because they can access this water freely and on their own or by their own choice. And maybe the land on their left does not have these same water rights. They might have to depend on government or on infrastructure or on different permits. Now, how this relates to sustainability, because it relates to the issue of influence by the state to persuade people to see if we all together can reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Because you can imagine that it's hard for us to persuade people to give up their land ownership or certain rights that are connected to land ownership in order to prevent, for instance, over-exploitation of groundwater. So when you look at water rights, it's not something that is just kind of, it's not something that is just has been. It is very related to how we divide water and how we make sure that everyone has access. So now the question comes, you have these water rights, but what if you don't have land ownership? What if you don't have land? What if you don't have a permit to have access to water? And that is where human rights come in, right? When it comes to human rights, we want to make sure that through human rights, everyone has access to those things that will give them a life in dignity. So that includes water. So the human right to water is a new development in the legal field. It is something that has been developing since the 2002, 2010, and I will take you along to explain how it developed and why it is necessary. So the first kind of ignition that this right had was during these events. Has anyone heard of or recognized this from the news? It's been a few years, but it is known as the first water wars. Anyone? It's okay to raise your hand. No. If you look closely, you can see some Spanish, so that gives away that it's a Spanish-speaking country. Sorry, Mexico City? No, it's not Mexico City, but on that side of the globe. No one? In the back, I heard someone? No. This is Bolivia, and these are the Cochabamba water wars of the 2000s, 1999. So what happened here was the privatization of municipal water access. And as a result of that, the prices hiked up, and a lot of people weren't able to pay for their water anymore. And as a result of that, thousands of people went out into the streets and protested this price rise. Now, this resulted in a lot of conflict, and eventually the privatization was revoked, and the rights to water came back into the hands of the municipality. But what was interesting about these water wars is that there was one central person who came up or who tried to support especially the farmers, and that was Evo Morales. So at that point, he was still in local government, and eventually he became the president in 2005. But he also was the person who in 2010 brought this issue of the human right to water to the international political agenda, to the UN. He came and presented a resolution on the human right to water in 2010, and that was then adopted by all the countries. So this meant that from then on, all states recognized that every human being has a human right to water, a human right to access to water. So this meant that now human right to water is actually a political recognized right. Now, why is this relevant? When we want actually human rights, or what is the reason behind human rights, is that we want everyone to have a life in dignity. We have made these rights, which are state obligations, and they relate to rights that are interdependent, indivisible, and interrelated. So no right is higher than the other, and all of the rights are interrelated. Now, these human rights are often also codified in national and international law. So we have different conventions, different treaties that talk about these human rights, but we also have constitutions that talk about rights. So in the Netherlands, we have our constitution where our civil rights are codified. The two most important covenants when it relates to human rights are the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which talks more about, for instance, the right to food, the right to housing, etc., and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which relates to, for instance, freedom of speech and the right to life. Now, in these two covenants, you can find all of the human rights that states are supposed to protect and respect and fulfill. Now, what is interesting about the human right to water, and that's why I started about the legal recognition or the political recognition, is that we cannot find the human right to water in any of these human rights instruments. We cannot find them in the two covenants that I was just mentioning. And some argue that it is because at the time when the covenants were established, when they were formalized, water was not so much an issue. Food was an issue, so that was put into the covenant, but other issues around water were not really on the agenda at that time. So the human right to water is not a right that you can find in these two covenants. But we want to make sure that we do kind of relate it to issues that are in the covenant. We have the right to adequate standard of living, we have the right to health, and the right to food. So you can see that water relates to all of these three rights, but it is not independently formalized in the covenant. And of course, we have the issue of sanitation. Sanitation and human right to water are very much related, but in the human rights framework, they are seen as two separate rights. So today, I'm going to be talking only about the right to water, and sanitation is seen as a separate right that has a separate history and a separate legal framework. And lastly, because the human right to water is not in the covenants, we have to look at one of the committees on economic and social rights. This is a committee that watches over the covenant and kind of observes whether or not states are living up to their obligations. What it also does is that it formulates rights or kind of explains what rights in practice mean. So this committee has made the human right to water, or has formulated it, and it is not legally binding, but it is authoritative. So it is something that we look to, we want to see what the human right to water really means and what states have to live up to. So this committee has made this human right to water in its general comment. And here it has stated that the human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. So this is kind of what we see as a human right to water, that everyone has access to safe, acceptable, physically accessible, etc. What is also interesting about the human right to water, or human rights in general, is that they require states to respect, protect, and fulfill them. Now, respect means that states should not interfere with your human right to water. So that means, for instance, if you already have access to water, states should respect this access and not intervene. So that means that you cannot, for instance, be disconnected without a proper judicial court that you can actually get redress at. Secondly, protecting means that the state should protect your human right to water from interference from others, so third parties. That means other citizens, but also companies. So for instance, if you're in a situation where a company is occupying your well, that is an obligation that the state, or the state has an obligation there to interfere and make sure that your human right to water is respected. And lastly, we have the obligation to fulfill. That means that the state should use all of their resources, available resources, to make sure that your human right to water is fulfilled. That means making sure that you have the infrastructure, that you can access water freely. So these are the obligations to the human right to water, and I will now kind of illustrate what the other aspects mean, so the safe, acceptable, etc., to kind of show you what might be the issues that certain states have and certain individuals have. So the first part is about it being sufficient, and that means sufficient for the different purposes that a human right to water has, and that is therefore available. So the human right to water only covers that there should be enough water for sustaining life, so drinking, food preparation, personal hygiene and sanitation, and washing clothes. So only these purposes or uses are covered by the human right to water. That means that all other water uses, such as, for instance, agriculture, are not covered by the human right to water. That is, for instance, covered under the right to food. Also, this relates, the World Health Organization has made a recommendation that the amount of water should be between 20 liters to 100. And that kind of depends on where you live, what your health status is, and what your working conditions are. So for instance, if you're someone with certain health problems, you are able to get access to more water than someone who does not have any health issues. Now, these are the guidelines for this, for how you should have water available and what the purpose is for. We have here an overview of the hierarchy of what should be covered by the human right to water and what other purposes we have. So you can see that between 10 to 50 liters is covered by the human right to water. Other purposes are not. But this is kind of an estimate, again, on how much liters are available for certain uses. And of course, this relates again to whether or not you're a healthy person, where do you live, and what kind of climate you have around you, and your working conditions. What is interesting about this right is also that, yes, it should be sufficient, but it should also be on a continuous basis. So that means that whenever you need access to water, whenever you need to be able to get to it. That also means that water should be accessible in every aspect of your life. So that is not only at home, but that also means at your work or at your school. So this is something that all relates into the availability of water. Now, water should also be safe, and it should be acceptable. So it should be free from any microorganisms that can be harmful or that are a threat to your personal health. And it should also have an acceptable odor, color, and taste. This also relates to water being culturally acceptable. So if a state wants to make water accessible, then they need to take into account the culture of the people that they are having this service for. So it's not only how the water or what the water looks like, what it tastes like, but also whether it is in line with the values of the community that you want to service. Now, one of the issues when it comes to this quality standards is something that was in the news last year. Whenever there's something about water, I always see it, and I'm like, oh, another water issue. But this is Flint, Michigan. And here there was an interesting issue with the infrastructure. So the infrastructure in Flint, Michigan was not kept well, and as a result, a lot of the lead from the pipes had gone into the water and had polluted the water. The local communities, the local municipality actually said that the water was safe for people to drink, so people continue to use this water, and as a result, now a lot of people have fallen ill, and especially children. And for them, lead has a negative effect on their neurological development. So now we have actually a public health issue in Flint, Michigan, when it comes to the quality of water. So this is something that relates to how states should live up to their obligations, because in this situation, the state should actually have intervened and should have made clean water accessible for these communities. But in this case, I think it's mostly economically motivated that they're unable or unwilling to renew the infrastructure. So the other issue is accessibility, and that relates to physical accessibility, so that people should be able to, within 1,000 meters, have access to water. Or 30 minutes collection time. So that means that even if water is far from or close by, but you're, for instance, living in a mountainous area, that it should be 30 minutes collection time. This very much relates to safety, because we know that, especially in the case of women and children, if they don't have access near their house, they are at risk of sexual molestation. So we know that in relation to this issue, access really relates to safety for a lot of these communities that don't have access yet. It should also be on the basis of non-discrimination, in the sense that communities should have access and should not be prevented access or should be excluded. What we see, for instance, in issues of water grabbing is that certain communities are being excluded because of economic purposes, also for companies who, for instance, want to take water from certain communities. And these communities are often those that are marginalized and that don't have access to, for instance, legal redress to kind of counter this issue. So they have limited access to legal rights. And lastly, we have the issue of affordability. And that means that water should not be free. A lot of people think that a human right to water should mean free access, but it actually means affordable access. And the UNDP has advised that it should not take more than 3% of the household income. And what is interesting with affordability is that a lot of people think that the poor actually don't give a lot of money or spend a lot of money on water. But often they relatively spend more money on water than communities that are directly connected to the infrastructure, because they pay for certain services, they pay for getting access, so often they spend more of their household income on water than other communities. Now, when you look at this list of accessibility, you often think of places outside of Europe, places in the global south, but this issue of affordability is also an issue here in the Netherlands. So Eén Vandaag did a report 2 years ago, and it talked about 20,000 households in the Netherlands being disconnected from water because of certain issues with affordability, but also with debt. What is also interesting about this is that of those 20,000 households, about 8,000 are households with children. So in the Netherlands, it's actually possible for you to be disconnected from water if you're unable to pay the bill, even if you have children in the household. So this is not just an issue of abroad, but this is also an issue right here. So when we talk about this human right to water, we can see that there are a lot of different challenges related to this right. One of the challenges is that there is a very high standard. Like I just said, there's a lot of requirements that states have to live up to, and we see that it is already hard for states to meet those standards. And we've also seen that with the previous Millennium Development Goals. So when you look at this graph, you can see that about 71% of people, this is an estimate, worldwide actually have access to water through a safely managed resource. But what's interesting about this is that it's only that the standard of safely managed is actually lower than the standard of the human right to water. So we can say that probably the number is a little bit lower. And you can see that even in certain areas or regions of the world, you can see that a lot of people don't have access to any type of safe water resource. So the standard of this human right to water is already very high. So that is one of the first challenges that we see. Another challenge is that we have competing water needs. When you think of drinking water, you also think of sustaining life. But besides that, water is also needed for a lot of economic goals that we have, but also for agriculture. And when I ask people how much do you think water actually, or drinking water actually takes up in our water uses, or our global water uses, often people think it's about 30%. But when we look at the numbers, it's actually only between 8 to 10%. So fresh water is actually being used for things such as agriculture more, and also for industrial use. So when we think of water, and when we think of communities that do not have access to safe water, sometimes we not only need to think about how to get that infrastructure, but also how to maybe circumvent some water from other uses towards drinking water. Because when we look at water, and as was mentioned in the introduction, what we know is that we have enough fresh water to meet all the needs of the people that are on Earth today. But when it comes to water scarcity and when it comes to this issue of water, it often relates more to power, poverty, and inequity than to the physical availability. It's more about who gets the rights and how do we divide the water equitably and fairly. So these are some of the challenges, the high standard, the competing water needs. But lastly, we also have the issue about that there's a focus on human needs. And in that sense, we have now figured out that water is actually a finite resource, and that we also have water, or we also need water for ecological purposes. Because in this day and age, we can see that water is diminishing and that even rivers are losing their vitality. So this is, for instance, California, where the last few years they have experienced a drought, and that the rivers there are actually running dry, literally. And we can also see other rivers that are having issues with pollution, such as the Yamuna River in India and the Ganges River, that are actually at the stage of being considered dead, so not able to sustain any form of life anymore. So with these issues occurring, we are actually thinking about how can we sustain a healthy river? How can we make sure that the rivers that we are depending on actually are maintained and that we can actually, for the future generations, also have access? So one of the ways in which this has been done, or one of the ways in which we're looking at how we can make sure that the rivers are healthy, is by sort of giving the river a voice. And that is also a new development in law, giving voices to natural phenomenon. And one of the first examples of this is the Whanganui River in New Zealand, but also the mountain Taranaki, also in New Zealand, and the Te Urewera Park, also in New Zealand. So these are three entities, natural entities, that have acquired legal personhood. And this, I say this is a new development, but this is actually based on the worldview of New Zealand's indigenous communities, the Maori communities. And they have sought to kind of find a way to make this voice legal. And they've done that by giving it legal personhood. And a lot of people think, okay, legal personhood for nature, that's kind of weird, that's kind of unusual. But when we think about it, it's not that strange, because we already live in a world where companies actually have legal personhood. So besides humans, other non-human entities could be acquiring legal personhood, or it's not so much of a stretch. And in this case in New Zealand, the Whanganui iwi, so that's the very specific tribe connected to this river, has argued for the recognition of this river as their ancestor. And they have connected that or translated that into legal personhood. Now, what does that look like in reality? So they've made a bill which takes away the property rights from the state. So the river no longer is belonging to the state, and it actually belongs to no one. Secondly, they have recognized the river as an ancestor, which has been translated into legal personhood. And that means that the river has been recognized not only as an ancestor, but all of its values that it has. So not only the physical values or the physical properties or characteristics, but also the metaphysical elements, and it's being recognized as a living whole. So that's very interesting, because that also relates to the worldview of the Maori people in recognizing that it's not only something that you rely on as a resource, but also something that has a spiritual connection to the community. So exactly the relationship between the river and the Whanganui iwi. And lastly, this means that there are two guardians have been assigned to be guardians over the river and to decide on issues that relate to the river. and also an advisory board that has been guided to make certain decisions, and that is connected or that is based on the law that is connected to this river. So the two guardians, one of the community, of the Maori community, and one from the government, together make decisions about the river. So that means that this river has legal personhood and rights, not human rights, but river rights. So for instance, it relates to the quality of the river, it relates to whether or not a dam can be built in the river, it relates to whether or not the river can be changed or its course can be changed. And the board and the two guardians, they preside over these issues. So what could be the added value of this? So one of the issues that communities often have is when they see that their water is being polluted or when rivers are being polluted, is that they need to have legal standing to do anything about it. And this legal standing is often connected whether or not you are directly affected by the pollution of the river, and often that is not the case. For instance, if your infrastructure is connected to something else, groundwater for instance, then you're not directly affected by the pollution of the river. So making the river into a legal, or having it have legal personhood, kind of takes away this issue of legal standing. It allows for certain communities, certain guardians to actually stand up and say that the whole river should be taken into account, and the quality of the whole river and the values that it brings to the community should be protected. So in this sense, it can be a way to actually have a new voice that should be balanced against the other voices, such as economic purposes or other human needs, for instance, that should be weighed against each other. Now, what is interesting about this development is, as I said, it's a new development, but it's something that is actually getting traction around the world. And it's also getting traction here in the Netherlands. So there's one a researcher here at this institute, Tineke Lamboy, who's actually arguing that the Waddenzee should have legal personhood, and that its legal personhood should be enshrined into our constitution. So this was an article from last year. But also this week, Ohio City actually voted for Lake Erie to have legal personhood. So this is in the US, and it means that people are able to become custodians or legal guardians of this Lake Erie to protect it. And this was especially in relation to the algae that they have been experiencing and that has been negatively affected the water quality. So you can see that this issue, or that this new development, is not only a development in New Zealand, but it is actually getting traction around the globe. And what I think is interesting about this development is that with the issues of rights and the issues of natural degradation or degradation of nature, is that it seems that we're moving from not only an issue of rights issues, but more towards seeing things as a rights and obligation issue. So it's not only that you have a human right to water, but it also is that you have an obligation or a duty to protect the water resources that are available. So this you can also relate to a new principle or a new universal declaration that talks about human rights and earth trusteeship. So that relates both of the issues, human rights and environmental issues. And the first principle in this one talks about the responsibilities that we have for Earth. So in this sense, recognizing that Earth has certain rights, or that nature has certain rights, and that we have obligations towards nature. And it also relates to how we as communities have responsibilities towards each other, and how we have also as individuals responsibilities. This does not take away the responsibilities that the state has, but it recognizes that we all have a hand in making sure that human rights are respected. And an example of this, for instance, is again the issue of South Africa, where you can now see that people are actually being rationed in their water supply. They can only have access to about 50 liters a day. And that means that some of them have to go to general municipal points, water taps to get access to more water than the 50 liters that they want, and sometimes even just the mere 50 that they want to have access to. But this relates also to how we as a community have responsibilities towards each other, and whether or not the state can intervene if you, for instance, use more than 50 liters. Because like you saw, the human right to water actually guarantees between 20 to 100 liters. So 50 liters is right in between. And it means that I think the state should be able to intervene if, for instance, people are using water for other uses that are not essential to sustaining your life. For instance, watering your lawn or washing your car. You should not be able to use drinking water to do that, but you should be able to use other sources, or gray water as we like to call it. So we are shifting from just a rights perspective to also an obligation perspective. So I'm already at the end, and I would like to summarize what we discussed. So we started off with looking at the human rights to water issue as just a new development that has started from sort of a counter movement from privatization towards actually guaranteeing that people have a human right to water and that everyone is guaranteed access. We have seen that the human right to water has different aspects that are actually pretty hard to guarantee. The standard is pretty high, and it is hard for states to live up to those expectations. We then looked at how we can balance the needs of not only human needs, but also water needs, or the needs of rivers, and how now we have a legal personhood, or a framework for legal personhood, that can actually help balance those type of needs out. And lastly, we looked at how we are moving from not only a rights-based perspective to more of an obligation, and that we as humans also have obligations towards each other, but also towards nature. So, lastly, to see the conclusion, who's got the right to water? Well, we basically all have a right to water based on the human right to water. But we are living in an age now where we are experiencing such water scarcity that we cannot ensure the human right to water without taking into consideration ecological needs. Thank you very much.